here before we actually get going on the class. So if there's any questions, I see a few people typing there. The chat will be going on through the event. I'll try to answer some of the questions, and Aaron will answer questions as we go. If there's any problems, you don't get your questions answered, sometimes the chat moves too fast if people ask a lot of questions. We definitely will hang around. Hey, Deb. We'll definitely hang around after Aaron's presentation and answer all your questions, make sure all of that stuff is taken care of. One little housekeeping thing, well, there's two actually. The first is if you have any problems at all with your audio or video, please let one of us know. We actually had somebody drop off of the last one, and we found out later that they could hear us but not see us, and I hate for that to happen. So if you have any issues with audio or video tonight, please let us know. I don't know what we'll do to fix it, but we'll try. Anyway, so just settle in, get comfortable, and we'll be back here in a minute and get this going. Oh, that's a good thing to do while we're waiting. Tell us what Sigma lenses you all own in the audience there. I like that. And we know lots of people who will buy your Tamron lenses, so please move on over.
Oh, somebody asked if anyone got any good shots of the Neowise Comet yet. Aaron, did you go shoot that?
I didn't get any of the Neowise. I went out trying to catch the time when Neowise and the Percy meteor showers were kind of overlapping, and I got some of the meteor showers, but the place I was shooting from, I didn't have a vantage on Neowise at that point. It was a little too late for that.
Yeah, here in Atlanta, it was so low on the horizon and so dim in the sky. I never really found a good place to try to go out and look for it. 1418 is unbelievable. We see a couple 150 to 600s. We have a winner there with a 300 to 800, so we have the focal length winner for the night. I don't know what the prize is, but
it's a 2 to 500.
Yeah. And your own personal Sherpa that carry it around for you.
Well, I was going to say it's its own weightlifting program.
Yeah.
You buy the 13-pound lens and it you get yourself in shape a little bit.
It's Body by Sigma.
Nice. This is great to see. A lot of people with a lot of glass. So Carlos got to shoot the comet.
Oh, cool. Yeah, let's see that.
Ooh, and Joshua Tree.
Nice. Yeah, good shot, Carlos.
All right, we'll give it about 30 more seconds. The other bit of housekeeping before I do some formal introductions and get this going is f32 is the camera store out of Knoxville, Tennessee. If you're not familiar with them, you should be. They are sponsoring this tonight, and they have some special rebates going on for the next 2 days. It'll be $25 or $50 off of Sigma lenses that don't already have rebates on them. So definitely can save you some kind of money. And then pretty much any of the other products that Aaron's going to talk about tonight, April would be able to get for you as well. So let's get this off the ground. My name is Brett Wells. I'm the tech rep for the Southeast for Sigma Photo. I've been in this side of the industry for about 10 years. Well, it doesn't matter what I do. I'm not teaching. I'm just the tech for the Southeast. So I'm here to support the event tonight and try to answer your questions if Aaron gets a little bit overwhelmed with the chat that's going through. This is April Love over here to my right. I don't know where she is on your screen. She's the owner of f32 in Knoxville, and we will definitely share with you a phone number and email address where you can get in touch with her and her store and her helpful staff if she's not available. And I think there'll be a follow-up email from this event to you, and I think that information will be shared there as well. So we'll make sure that you get that information. Then the other gentleman here is Aaron Norberg. He is our tech out of the Pacific Northwest, based in Portland. And a great photographer and a great speaker, and you all are in for a great treat tonight. I'll turn it over to Aaron.
Awesome. Thank you, Brett, and thank you, April, for hosting us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. As I get into this presentation, I'm going to turn my camera off so we can just focus on the material. If you have any questions as we're going along, please use the chat forum. We'll be keeping an eye on that as we go along. And we will have some time at the end as well to answer questions. But with this kind of material, it is a little bit more technically challenging than some other fields of photography. There's definitely more potential points of confusion. So if you have a question or if something needs to be clarified as we're going through it, I find it's best to try to address it right there while we're talking about it, because especially with a group this size, if there's something that you're unsure about, there's a good chance there's someone else in the audience wondering the same thing. And it can be a little easier, a little more effective for us to just address it right there while we're covering it. But that said, we will have some time at the end as well. So if we don't get to cover everything as it comes along, just hold on to those questions, and we'll be sure that everyone's questions are answered before we depart for the day. And with that said, let's go ahead and jump in.
Brett, did you hit record?
Yes, we're recording, and I'm turning my mic and camera off now too.
All right, you guys can see my presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. All righty. So, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. This is a quick peek at what we're going to be covering tonight. We're going to start by figuring out what locations are best suited for night sky photography, how to go about scheduling your outings, and then what gear you're going to want to have with you as you're out there. And then we'll get into some of the basics on getting exposure correct, and we'll share a few pointers on general settings and getting focus. So this is aimed at more of a beginner user, someone who's probably never gone out and done night sky. This is definitely a field that there are very wide-ranging levels of skill required depending on what technique you want to take. So this class is really oriented for people who haven't done it before, and it's geared to try to get as much done in camera as possible to try to save you from having to spend more time than what you might want to do in post-production after the fact. So with that in mind, let's get started with location scouting. And this part is critical in night sky photography, as by the time the conditions are right for us to be out shooting, it's going to be too dark for you to really safely wander around trying to find a vantage point, especially if it's an unfamiliar area. So it's really important to make sure that we have these locations nailed down before it gets dark. So a great place to start looking for general locations would be the locations you tend to shoot landscape photography in the daytime. I find locations that I've photographed out in the landscape to be generally well suited for night sky photography. But if you're new to landscape photography, this may be initially a challenge because you'll probably have to get a ways out of town to get far enough from the light pollution of urban centers. So if you're looking for places to start, try looking up and visiting any parks or wilderness areas that might be near you. Ideally, what we're looking for are locations that are removed from heavy light pollution sources and locations that offer expansive skies. Now, if you're looking to photograph both terrestrial and astral elements, you'll also want to keep an eye out for features on the ground that we can use to populate the foreground of our image. If you're primarily interested in photographing objects in the sky, then what's on the ground isn't as important. The biggest concern then would be getting as far away from light pollution as possible and getting as expansive a view of the sky as you can. Now, that said, not all landscape scenes are going to be ideal locations for night sky, however. If your composition doesn't include much of the sky, then the stars are not going to have a whole lot of impact in the image itself. So keep this in mind as you're location scouting during the day. You can certainly photograph around man-made elements too. You'll just have to keep an eye on how much the surrounding light pollution is affecting your exposure, as the light emitted by the stars in the sky is very, very faint in comparison to the artificial light that we have on the ground. And it doesn't take much light pollution to overpower the relatively faint stars in the sky. And light pollution can impact locations that may seem remote in the daytime too. This viewpoint,
Aaron, can you?
yeah.
Hey, sorry to interrupt. There's a few people that can't hear. You want to try refreshing your microphone just in case?
Sure. All right. Is that any better?
And anybody out there, if you're having trouble, make sure that you reset yours. Under your settings, under the audio video settings, there's a refresh. So you might want to try that. And if that doesn't work, try logging in again. Sorry to interrupt here, but I just want to make sure.
Can you hear me okay, Brett?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So even in areas that might seem remote enough, you're going to have to keep an eye out for light pollution. This viewpoint here in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State is about a 90-minute drive from the Portland area. But it's still not far enough to get away from the light pollution from Portland. Trying to escape the glow of artificial lighting can be a big challenge in getting started to finding suitable locations for night sky. Luckily, there are a handful of really great resources that we can use to try to help narrow down that search more quickly than just going out and seeing what you find. And my absolute favorite resource for this part of the journey is a site called Dark Site Finder. By inputting the zip code of an area that you're trying to shoot from, you can view light pollution levels for that area as a Google Map overlay. And the warmer colors here leading into white indicate higher levels of light pollution, whereas cooler colors leading into black indicate lower levels of light pollution. And this can be an incredibly effective way to narrow down your search area initially. Ideally, we want to try to find locations within the blue or gray regions. But this can also be helpful information to keep in mind as you're orienting yourself from a potential shooting location in the field. If you're shooting in an area with relatively low immediate light pollution, but your camera is pointed towards a source of high light pollution, it may still impact your images. And conversely, on the other side of that, if you have to shoot from an area that has higher than ideal levels of light pollution, if you can orient your camera away from those light sources, you might still be able to make a better image in that location. Now, one of the other major issues in getting started in finding night sky locations is knowing what astral bodies will be active in the sky once the sun has gone down. And this one can be really tricky, as the elements in the sky will vary throughout the seasons. It's also really difficult to know what you're going to find until you actually are out there taking a picture. It takes quite a bit of work to get to that point. So this is where my next suggested planning tool really shines. It's an application called Photo Pills, P-I-L-L-S. And it's one of my favorites. One of the features in this app that makes this so much easier is something called Night AR, or augmented reality. With the app installed on your phone, you can take a photo of a location that you're scouting for a night sky image, and Photo Pills will overlay an augmented reality image of what astral features will appear from that location at night. And you can also move your time frame around within the app to see how the elements of the sky will change from that location over time, which can be really helpful in gauging if there might be a better time, a better month, a better season to photograph from that location that you found. And it's an incredibly helpful tool for me in visualizing what would otherwise require just a lot of trial and error and time out in the field, photographing to see what's up there. This app does have a one-time fee of $10, and it features a number of other functions. Honestly, I think if you're going to be out doing night sky photography more than once or twice a year, it's well worth the investment. With these tools at our disposal, finding a great location for a successful night sky shoot becomes much easier. Another aspect to keep in mind as we're evaluating potential locations is whether or not our access is going to change after sunset. Some locations in the state and national park and forest systems may only be open from sunrise to sunset. So be sure that you check that once you have a location in mind before heading out for an evening shoot. Any questions on location scouting? All right, so now that we've got that out of the way, let's move forward into when to look up. And we're going to start by just covering the seasonality of the night sky. As I mentioned a moment ago, the elements that we see in the sky any given night for any location that we might be shooting from will vary depending on the time of year. Now, when you consider that the Earth is in constant rotation and it's orbiting around the sun, it makes total sense why our view in the night sky is going to vary over time. But nonetheless, this can be one of the more difficult aspects to try and plan around when it comes to scheduling an outing. So let's take a look at one of the most popular subjects for night sky photography, the Milky Way, for example. The Milky Way's viewing season begins in February. And between February and June, the Milky Way will gradually rise higher and higher above the horizon in the night sky. But it reaches its highest point every night just before astronomical twilight begins and night ends, which means the peak viewing times this early in the season are going to be very early in the morning hours, and the coming sunrise may be a limiting factor. Dark Sight Finder, I typically would recommend using on the web browser before you go out. If you're out in the field and you're not sure if it's going to be a dark enough location, I think that there are features in PhotoPills that you can use to try to gauge that, but usually I would use Dark Sight Finder as kind of a starting point to figure out what areas I might want to find a location within. And then from there, I'll go out and location scout during the day. And then while I'm out location scouting, I'll use PhotoPills to try to figure out what my vantage point is going to be from any given spot. All right, so back to the seasonality of the Milky Way. As we get into early July, viewing becomes much easier, as the Milky Way will already be above the horizon as the sky becomes dark enough to observe it. So around mid-July, the Milky Way usually will reach its peak around midnight, but it will still be easily visible in the hours before and after. Now, as the season moves on through early November, the Milky Way will reach its highest point in the night sky earlier and earlier, gradually becoming harder to discern from the setting sun in the early evening hours. So with this general trajectory in mind, the period between late June and late August offers most people some of the best chances to get a good shot of the Milky Way. Photographing earlier or later than this midsummer window is still possible, but it will require more precise planning, and generally it will require kind of perfect conditions to get a good shot. So it definitely makes it more challenging. And then from November to January, you're not going to see the Milky Way in the night sky at all. So once we have a general grasp on the seasonality of objects in the night sky, we can start to drill into the impact that the sun and the moon have on the sky and how to best plan around their movements. So what we observe as sunset is technically referred to as civil twilight. This period is also known as the blue hour, and it follows the more famous golden hour just before sunset, and it extends into astronomical twilight. And during this time, the sun has moved below the horizon, but there's still enough light in the sky to illuminate terrestrial objects, and in the sky, only the brightest stars and planets are going to be visible. So while the last remnants of sunset can make it difficult to see anything but the brightest stars, that extra light can allow you to retain more detail in your foreground. So this can also be a good time for photographing the moon if you want to have the moon in the frame, as the exposure difference between the moon and the surrounding sky isn't going to be as dramatic. It'd be easier to get them both in one exposure. But if we're primarily concerned with imaging the stars, the end of astronomical twilight is generally the earliest we want to start. And at this point, there'll be no sunlight in the sky above, and you'll be able to clearly see stars and planets. Now, there are many apps and programs available to calculate the absolute time of these events from a specific location once you have a specific location in mind. But generally speaking, a good rule of thumb is most of the time you'll be reaching this period around 2 hours after sunset. And once we pass astronomical twilight, the distant and relatively faint stars in the sky will finally have a chance to shine. It makes it much easier to image. Now, once we've got the sun schedule sorted out for our outing, the next aspect we want to consider is that of the moon.
And this can be a little bit more involved than the sun, because not only do we have to account for the varying time of the moon's rising and setting in the sky, but we also have to account for what phase the moon is going to be in during the night that we're trying to go out. And you can get very detailed information on moonrise, moonset, along with moon phases plotted out on a calendar from dedicated sources like here I was referencing Deluxe Moon. They have this information freely available on their website or through a paid app. And this would be information that I would generally try to figure out before I go out into the field for an evening. But you can also get enough general information to plan around the phases of the moon in most weather apps now too. So check that before you commit to buying another app. And again, if we're primarily interested in seeing the stars, the best conditions are generally going to be between the end of astronomical twilight and the beginning of moonrise, when the sky is at its darkest. Now, if you happen to be out during a new moon phase, you'll have an even wider window of ideal conditions because you won't need to worry about the moon's presence competing with the fainter, more distant stars. Crescent moon phases can still allow for great star shots, but if you get beyond a quarter moon, you should probably plan on shooting before moonrise or another evening if possible, because it's going to be hard to see as many stars in the sky with that much light coming off the moon. On the other hand, though, the new moon phase is going to be the best for shooting the stars, but with no light reflecting off the moon to your foreground. You may need to use light painting if you want to have any detail on the ground beyond a silhouette. So another great resource that I would recommend that can be really helpful in making visual sense of all of these elements and how they play into a specific location is called the Photographer's Ephemeris. Once you have a specific location in mind, the Photographer's Ephemeris will tell you not only the exact timing of sunset and moonrise, but it will also plot the direction of these events from the perspective of that location. And I find that this can be really helpful in trying to pre-visualize what impact the moon may have on a composition if I'm going out on a day that I know the moon's going to be in the sky. The Photographer's Ephemeris offers this information for free through their website, and they do also have a paid app for mobile platforms. But this is another one that I find is best done before I go out for an evening. If I'm not sure about it by the time I'm out, generally taking the time to like plot out a location on a map is going to be difficult to do on a mobile phone. And once we have the location nailed down and we have a general date range in mind, one of the final considerations for planning an outing is the weather forecast. Clear, dry nights are definitely the best for photographing the stars if you want to have the best view of the sky. A few scattered clouds can still make for a great night sky image, but overcast evenings and evenings with a high chance of precipitation are best avoided. Clouds will also reflect light pollution up from the ground, so this can impact your images even from an otherwise dark location. Any questions so far on timing? We're okay? All right. So now we've got a location or two picked out. We've got a few potential nights in mind with good shooting conditions between the moon phase, the weather forecast, and we've figured out our approximate window between sunset and moonrise. So next, let's take a quick look at what equipment we might want to have with us as we venture out into the night. One of the first considerations I run through in picking what equipment I'm taking with me is the imaging format of the camera, or its sensor size. As we've just discussed, the best time to photograph the stars begins around 2 hours after sunset. Now, of course, that means we're going to be photographing in the absence of one of the essential components of photography we may otherwise take for granted, which is sunlight. And this is one area where the difference in sensor size can really yield noticeable differences in image quality. Larger sensors with greater total surface area generally will exhibit broader dynamic range and less visual noise at high ISO values when compared to smaller sensors. This is also an instance where the age of the sensor being used can make a significant impact on your image quality. More recent sensor designs that implement backside illuminated construction or dual ISO processing channels can allow for appreciably cleaner images at high ISO values. Now, both DSLRs and mirrorless cameras have their own inherent strengths and weaknesses for this type of photography, but both can be used successfully. APS-C and Micro Four Thirds cameras can certainly be used successfully here too. So I'm not trying to say that you need to go out and buy a brand new full frame camera to get a good shot after dark. But as a general suggestion from what I've found works best, I try to use the most recent camera with the largest sensor that I have access to. Now, if your camera is more than 5 or 6 years old and you're planning on doing a lot of night sky shooting, then it may be worth looking at getting into a newer body. Otherwise, just start shooting with what you have. And we're going to get to exposure durations in just a moment. We'll talk about that in greater depth there. Now, once we know what camera we're going to be taking along, the next consideration for me is what lens I'm going to be using. MFT would be Micro Four Thirds. It's a sensor format size shared by Olympus and Panasonic. And we'll talk more about that in a minute too, and how it impacts actual shooting parameters in the field. So for me, for lenses, there are two primary considerations when I'm weighing my options. The first would be the field of view. Second would be maximum aperture. So let's start with field of view, or focal length. As focal length decreases, our angle of view of the scene in front of us increases. This means we'll be able to see more of the sky in the foreground in the scene before us. To make visual sense of that, let's take, for example, this scene from the Mount Hood National Forest here in Oregon. This image was made using a 24mm field of view. It's a super common focal length you'll find covered by just about any lens that gets bundled with new cameras. So there's a good chance any one of us here tonight could shoot an image that looks like this in terms of perspective. Now, for comparison's sake, this next image was made from the exact same position using a much wider focal length of 14mm. Notice how much more of the sky we're seeing with this wider angle of view. We'll go back here. So this is 24 versus 14. And I haven't moved at all within the scene. So we can see, not only am I seeing more of the sky, but the Milky Way here at 24mm, you're just starting to see a little bit of it on the corner of the frame there. If I wanted to get more of that, that means I'd probably have to lose Mount Hood off to the left. With a wider focal length, I'm able to get much more of the sky, the Milky Way, and not that there's much detail in the foreground there, but without having to move within the scene, which in this case wasn't physically possible. Now, the trade-off here is that of scale. The more of the sky that we see, the smaller the individual stars are going to become in the resulting image. So try to keep this in mind when you're deciding which lens you want to take with you on your outing. If you want to see as much of the sky as possible, you'll want to stick on the wider side of your focal length options. If you want to see more detail from specific stars or constellations, then you might want to try a lens with a little bit longer focal length. Now, in addition to field of view or focal length, the other consideration that I keep foremost when I'm going through options for lenses is that of maximum aperture, or how much light that lens is capable of transmitting. This attribute can make an incredible difference in the relative ease and overall success of your outings. Because again, we're going to be out shooting well after the sun has left the sky. And we really need to be able to capture as much of that light from our scene as possible. So this image here was made with the 35mm DGDN art f1.2. It was shot at f1.4. Now, for comparison's sake, this next image, made from the same spot with the same exposure settings, the aperture was closed down to f3.5, which is a maximum aperture you'll commonly find in the lenses that come bundled with new camera bodies. And notice how much less light we're getting in the scene using the same exposure parameters. It's an enormous difference. At the same ISO and the same exposure duration, the difference between f1.4 and f3.5 is pretty stark. So in this instance, if you didn't have a lens that could open up wider than 3.5, you'd have to figure out exactly how long you can go before those stars start to turn into trails. And then you would just have to increase your ISO well beyond what I had here. Now, with that in mind, I generally would recommend shooting with a lens that has a maximum aperture of f2.8 or brighter if you're planning on capturing star points. Anything slower than that is going to severely limit your other exposure parameters, and it's going to make it much more difficult to get a successful image. Now, if you're trying to capture star trails rather than star points, the maximum aperture is way less important because we'll actually be doing longer duration exposures then. But we'll touch on those specifics in just a moment. So generally speaking, with those considerations in mind, here are the focal lengths that I would generally recommend for people starting out who want to shoot a little bit on the wider side. For full frame sensors, that would be focal lengths between 14 and 35. If you've got some coverage there, you should be good to go. For cameras that use an APS-C size sensor, that works out to be somewhere in the 10 to 24 millimeter range. And for micro four thirds sensors, that works out to be somewhere between 7 and 18 millimeters. Now, when choosing between zooms and primes, the first thing you want to take a look at would be the maximum aperture. A zoom lens will give you more flexibility by allowing you to change your composition in the field without physically moving in the field, which isn't always possible. But they generally won't be able to transmit as much light as a fixed focal length lens. The prime lenses within this range in Sigma's lineup will all feature a maximum aperture of f1.8 or 1.4, where most of the zooms are going to be f2.8 or slower. So for imaging star points, try to stick to 2.8 or brighter. Now, once we've got our camera and lens figured out, there are a few other accessories we want to make sure we have ready to go. First and foremost is a tripod. In daylight photography, our shutter speeds are generally going to be fractions of a second, so we don't have to worry as much about motion blur. But once the sun has gone down, exposure durations are going to increase to full seconds, and in some instances may even last minutes. And there's just no way we can hold a camera steady on our own for that kind of time. So you're definitely going to need a tripod, otherwise you're going to be at the mercy of whatever you can rest your camera on in the field. So if you don't already have one, try to find a tripod that has enough height to reach your eye level without extending the center column if possible. As you get your camera higher and higher from where those legs connect, you start to lose a little bit of the stability. And try to make sure that both the legs and the head are rated to support more weight than whatever the heaviest camera and lens combination you anticipate using. Now, as our exposure durations drag out into whole seconds and longer, we also run into the possibility of creating movement in the camera simply by the action of pressing the shutter button. And this is true even with a solid tripod. So these residual vibrations can lead to motion blur in our images, and obviously we want to try to prevent that. So to do that, we're going to need to find a way to trip our exposure without touching the camera, or at least to delay the shutter to allow those vibrations to settle down before the shutter opens. Many recent cameras with built-in Wi-Fi or Bluetooth connectivity can be initiated remotely using a free app. If you've got a recent camera, definitely check into that. And if not, nearly every interchangeable lens camera will have a remote shutter available as an accessory. And there are also many third-party options available for remote shutters as well. At the very least, any camera that we'd be using for this should have a self-timer function. And you can use that to let the camera settle from the shutter being pressed before it initiates exposure. If you're getting into really long duration exposures, you may need a remote for that, as most cameras internally are only going to be able to go up to 30-second durations, and anything beyond that, you'd have to go into bulb mode. So be sure, if you haven't done really long exposures before and you're planning on doing star trails, be sure to test that before you leave to make sure you've got the equipment to time your exposure correctly. Now, we also want to make sure we've got enough consumables to make it through the outing. Memory cards are relatively inexpensive now, so it's not too hard to make sure we've got a couple 32 or 64 gig cards handy. Batteries, on the other hand, you may need to stock up on if you haven't done night sky before. The imaging sensor that the camera uses to record and the rear screen both place a high drain on your camera's battery, and you'll be using both of those more frequently at night than what you might be used to during the day. Lithium-ion batteries also tend to lose capacity at lower temperatures too, which only helps to speed up how quickly you're going to be running through those batteries at night. So if you're shooting with a mid-size or larger DSLR that has a larger battery pack, you may only need an extra battery or two. But if you're shooting with most mirrorless cameras or a smaller DSLR that has a smaller battery, I'd recommend making sure you've got anywhere between 2 and 4. And then lastly, we want to make sure that we ourselves can remain safe and comfortable while we're out shooting too. Air temperatures are going to be lower at night than during the day, and you're not going to be moving around much between exposures. So make sure you've got warmer clothes with you than what you would have been wearing during the daytime. And be sure to bring a couple extra layers just in case you get cold. A headlamp that has a red light is also a super invaluable accessory for these outings. It allows you to keep both hands free, so you don't have to hold the light. And it also makes it easier to see what you're doing without affecting your night vision. But that red light will still show up in photographs, so be sure to switch it off before you begin an exposure. We also want to make sure we've got outer layers to ward off any potential precipitation if there's a chance of rain in the forecast. Many of the places that we're going to be shooting at night are going to be remote, so plan on taking anything you may need for the evening with you before you leave. As for condensation, generally that happens when there's a big variance between the temperature of the air inside your equipment and outside your equipment. So what I would recommend would be to keep your equipment out in the period that you're waiting for astronomical twilight so that it can acclimate to the changing temperature air temperature, gradually, and then you won't have that issue. If you're going to be going in and out, like shooting from inside a cabin or a car, you can bring like those hand warming packs with you. That can be helpful, but generally that's only going to work for a short period. So if you're going out in really cold or really humid environments, or you're going to be going in and out of different temperature zones often, you might want to stock up on some of those. So the red light, the red light just doesn't impact your night vision. So if you are going between white light and then no light, it's going to take your eyes some time to transition in either direction, and it will just slow your process down. Okay, so with the equipment covered, let's next jump into some of the exposure and focus settings. Now, there are definitely a multitude of ways to arrive at a successful image, and we certainly can't touch on every method in this course, but many of the more advanced techniques are going to involve taking multiple exposures and compositing them together in post-production. But for the sake of this introductory course, I want to try to get you guys ready to make the most of a single capture so we can focus more on shooting and less on editing. So we're going to hit our exposure settings with that in mind. Now, before we jump into the nitty-gritty, though, we're going to have to do a quick review of the basics. Astrophotography is a pretty complex field, and it demands a lot of both the equipment and the practitioner. So having a working knowledge of the basic parameters of exposure and how they each affect not only exposure, but the creative aspects of an image will make it much easier to get a successful photograph. So let's just take a quick run through here. This might be a review for a lot of people, but if there's anything that's unclear as we're going here, please feel free to throw those questions out. So first we have aperture, and this is a function of the lens. It's a numerical value describing the relative diameter of the opening within the lens. And this controls how much light is allowed to travel through the lens from our scene to reach the shutter in the camera. So our next parameter is that shutter. Shutter speed is a function of the camera body. It's a fractional value describing the duration in which the light exiting the lens will be allowed to reach the sensor. And then finally, we have ISO speed. ISO is a numerical value for the sensitivity of the sensor, which dictates how much overall exposure is required. Now, in addition, each of these attributes have an impact on the creative impact of the image. So for aperture, in addition to controlling how much light is passing through the lens, f-stop also impacts the depth of field of an image. And if you're not familiar with the term, depth of field describes the area of an image that's considered acceptably sharp. And this extends both in front of and behind the point of peak sharpness, which is where the lens is actually focused in the scene. So wider apertures or smaller f-stop numbers like f1.4 will yield a more narrow depth of field, whereas smaller apertures, which are larger f-stop numbers like f8, will yield a wider or greater depth of field. Now this can be one of the great technical challenges in night sky photography, getting your depth of field to adequately cover both elements on the ground and the stars in the sky without using so small an aperture that you're severely limiting the amount of light passing through the lens. And we'll touch on how to make the most of your depth of field in just a moment. But next, let's cover shutter speed. So in addition to controlling the duration of exposure, shutter speed also affects how motion is rendered. Shorter durations, which are represented by smaller fractional values, will tend to freeze motion, whereas longer duration exposures, which are represented by larger fractional values, are in most cases at night, extending into whole numbers, will tend to blur motion. And in daylight photography, we typically aim to use a shutter speed that's fast enough to freeze both camera and subject motion, unless we're trying to intentionally blur it. But in night sky photography, we don't need to worry so much about camera motion since we're on a tripod, but we still need to make sure we're not getting motion blur in our scene. And we'll touch on that in just a moment. But lastly, we have our ISO speed. And imaging sensors actually only have one level of sensitivity. It's referred to as the camera's base ISO. Any value higher than that base ISO is achieved by amplifying the signal coming off the sensor to increase the signal captured at lower exposure values or in dark situations. Amplifying the sensor signal, though, it also tends to amplify the visual noise in the resulting image, as well as reduce the overall dynamic range of the image captured. And as we're trying to depict small, distant stars in an otherwise black sky, both of these attributes are counterproductive. So we generally want to try to keep our ISOs as low as possible. But that said, ISO does tend to be the easiest parameter to modulate to achieve an adequate exposure in night sky photography. And high ISO performance now is drastically better than what it was even just a few years ago. Unless your camera sensor is more than 4 or 5 years old, you shouldn't have to worry too much about using higher ISOs to make sure you get adequate exposure. Okay, so now that we've got the basics covered, let's get into some of the specifics for night sky photography. We're going to start by tackling exposure duration first, as this will largely impact both aperture and ISO parameters as well. So as we touched on a moment ago, shutter speed affects how motion is recorded in our scene. And if we're shooting the stars from a tripod, what motion do we really need to be concerned with? Well, as we know, the Earth is in constant rotation. And if we leave the shutter of the camera open while it's tethered to the ground for long enough, we'll actually start to see this rotational motion recorded in our images. So the first rule I'm going to share here are, I like to call them principles because like any rule in photography, I wouldn't say it's a hard and fast rule, but rather a good place to start. The 500 rule aims to help us gauge how long we can go with exposure duration before our star points turn into blurred star trails. And the principle is pretty straightforward to understand and to implement. You simply divide the number 500 by your effective focal length to arrive at the maximum number of seconds that you can leave your shutter open before you start to incur motion blur. Now, of course, there are a few caveats to observe here. First of all, this principle requires that we know our effective focal length, which means we need to know our camera sensor size as well. Second, the relative sharpness or relative success of this principle can depend on the resolution of your camera sensor and on your own subjective determination of what is acceptably sharp. So personally, I've found that if I'm working with a sensor of 18 megapixels or higher resolution, I actually need to be a little bit more conservative than what the 500 rule would indicate. Now, in this case, if you've had this experience before, you can simply use a smaller number than 500, say 400 or 300, or you can simply decrease your exposure duration from whatever number the 500 rule calculation yields. So before we get into the mechanics of applying the 500 rule, let's briefly touch again on how sensor size impacts our effective focal length. And the keystone to understanding these crop factors is the 35mm film format. Digital sensors that match the dimensions of a 35mm piece of film are referred to as full-frame sensors. Any sensors smaller than this are commonly referred to as cropped sensors. And the most common sizes down from the full-frame format would be APS-C, and then down from that would be micro four thirds. So APS-C is a format that's used by just about everyone at this point, except for Panasonic and Olympus. Panasonic and Olympus use the micro four thirds format, and then Panasonic now also has full-frame format. So as sensor size decreases, the effective angle that it observes from the lens in front of it also decreases. So this has the effect of increasing subject magnification, which is similar to the effect that a longer focal length can have. And that's where the term crop factor comes from. It tries to simplify this relationship by relating sensor scale to focal length, something that's a little bit easier to visually understand. So an APS-C size sensor generally yields around a 1.5 times crop relative to a full frame sensor. And a micro four thirds size sensor would be effectively a 2 times crop factor. So with that in mind, let's plug some numbers into this 500 rule and see what we get. Let's use the 14mm ART, for example. With our crop factors in mind, it becomes relatively easy to calculate our effective focal length for any format camera we may be using. With a full frame camera, it has a 1 times crop, or effectively no crop. So 14, the focal length times 1 is just that, 14. With an APS-C size sensor that has a 1.5 or 1.5 times crop factor, we multiply the focal length of 14 by that crop factor, 1.5, and it yields an effective focal length of 21mm. And then for micro four thirds crop factors, for the 2 times crop, we multiply 14 by 2 to arrive at 28mm for an effective focal length. And once we have our effective focal lengths, we can easily arrive at a maximum exposure duration for this lens. If I'm shooting a 14mm on a full frame camera, I've got around 36 seconds before I start to see star trails. On APS-C size cameras, that same lens, I'm gonna have about 24-second window. And if I put that same lens on a micro four thirds camera, it's gonna drop down to about 18 seconds. So that is one thing to keep in mind if you're juggling between different cameras to take out with you. Now, after you've gone out a few times to shoot the stars, you probably aren't going to need to reference this calculation much, as you'll remember what's worked for you in the past. But it's a good tool to get started. This calculation is also built into the PhotoPills application, and their implementation of it makes it even easier to reference out in the field if you're using a couple different lenses. You simply put in the camera brand and camera model that you're using and what focal length you're using. And it will take all of these considerations into all of these attributes into consideration for you. Once we've run this calculation, we'll know roughly how long we can leave the shutter open before we start to see our stars trailing. Now we know we're going to want to leave our lens at or near its maximum aperture to make sure we're getting as much of the limited light in our scene back to our camera as possible. So now that we've got exposure duration and aperture figured out, that just leaves ISO as our variable for exposure. Generally, I've found that my ISO tends to fall somewhere between 1600 and 6400, depending on the night and the conditions. So with that in mind, I'll usually start at ISO 3200 for my first exposure, and then move up or down from there, depending on how my histogram looks. Before we go any further, any questions on focal length and exposure duration? Does that all make sense? Looks like we're okay. All right. So we're going to touch on histograms real quick. Maybe. Let's see. Yeah. Yeah, so if I'm starting out with the 500 rule, let's say in this instance, it was 35, so that was a full frame camera. So if I take 500 and and divide it by 35, my effective focal length. That gives me, in this instance, with this equipment, about a 14-second window that I should have before those stars start to trail. So what I'll typically do is I'll start there, and then after I've taken a shot, I'll review that image and get in close to the stars to see, are they remaining as points? Are they starting to trail? And if I see that they're starting to move, that's where I have to then make a decision on how critical I want to be of that. Because if you're viewing an image at a screen viewing size, if you're not going to be cropping in on that image, a little bit of trailing is generally not going to be noticeable. That being said, I try to avoid it as much as I can because I want to future-proof these images as best I can. So once if I review that then and I find it's trailing, I might bracket my exposure down a little bit. If I find that it's not trailing and I'm pushing one of my other parameters, like maybe I want to stop the aperture down a little bit or try running at a lower ISO, then I'll experiment with those. But usually you'll find pretty quickly with your camera, sensor size, and lens combination at what point you're going to start to see more trailing than what you would like to see. And then you just keep that figure in mind. Because as long as you don't change your lens, the focal length, or your camera, that number is not going to change for that whole outing. So that'll give you, don't go any longer than, say, 10 seconds. Does that make sense? Okay, all right, so generally, once I get the star trail duration where I want it, so it's not going to be detracting from my image, then I want to look at my exposure and make sure that I'm in the right ballpark. So what I use to gauge my exposure is not going to be the screen on the camera, but my histogram. And if you're not familiar with the term or how to read one, let's briefly touch on what a histogram is and how it can help you to judge exposure in the field. The histogram that we have in front of us here, it maps out the tonal range of our image. And from left to right, it reads from absolute black on the left side there to absolute white on the right side there. And all of our shadows and midtones and highlights are going to be in between there. So this histogram right here is typical of a photo taken in daylight. All of the tonal information is contained more or less within the extremes, which means we aren't losing or clipping any information to either the shadow or the highlight regions. Now, this histogram is going to be more typical of what you're likely going to see when you're shooting at night. As our ambient light levels are very low, most of the information in our scene is likely going to occupy the shadow region of the histogram scale. And that's okay. But what we want to try to make sure is that there is some degree of separation between the spikes of information and that left edge of the histogram. And in this instance, we can see the information is running right up to that edge and there's no clear separation. And that means we're probably losing some information in the shadows of our image. And this is commonly referred to as clipping our shadows. So by looking at that and modifying my exposure, I've already got my exposure duration figured out. So in this case, I just increased my ISO. I was able to move that tonal information from the scene to the right in my histogram, which now we can see there's a little bit of a separation between the information on the histogram and that left border of absolute black. So for night sky images, do expect that your histogram is probably going to inhabit most of the left half of your histogram. Just make sure that we're not losing any critical information to clipping. And the exposure program, generally for this kind of shooting, it's going to be full manual. I'm going to be shooting in manual mode, manually setting aperture, shutter speed, white balance, ISO. The good thing is, obviously, there's no light in the scene, so once you have those parameters set, you're not going to need to vary much from shot to shot unless you're changing your focal length. And hopefully these tips that we're covering here will help us get to that ballpark of correct exposure. Now, if we want to get into doing star trails instead of star points, we kind of want to go the other direction. So with star trails, we're actually trying to accentuate the rotation of the Earth rather than minimize it. So instead of staying within the maximum duration that we figured out using that 500 rule, we're actually going to intentionally go beyond it. So that number would basically be our starting point. And once we get into minute-long exposures, though, you can pretty easily burn up a lot of time and a lot of battery power by bracketing exposures until you figure out the right exposure. Luckily, we do have another quick tip we can share to speed that process up. This one can be a little bit wordy, so I'm going to take a moment to try to carefully walk through it, and then we'll see if we have any questions after that. So the difference in exposure values between exposure durations in seconds and exposure durations in minutes is approximately 6 stops. So an exposure made in seconds at an ISO 6 stops above your base ISO will be equal to an exposure made in minutes at your base ISO. And let's throw some numbers in there and see if that helps to clear anything up. So what that means for adding 6 stops to our base ISO, if our base ISO is 100, going 6 stops beyond that is going to put us at ISO 6400. So let's put some actual numbers in there. If we take a 15-second exposure at f56 at ISO 6400, that exposure value is going to be the same value as a 15-minute exposure at the same aperture of f56 at our base ISO of 100. Hopefully that helps to make a little bit more sense of this, but knowing how to apply this simple equation can save you hours in the field trying to guess at the correct exposure once we get into really long exposures. And in this instance here, my exposure value was about 35 minutes. So you can imagine if I started with a 10-minute exposure, well, that's too dark. If I go to a 20-minute exposure, well, that's still too dark. So maybe I go to a 40-minute exposure. Well, that's too long. But now I've also gone through like an hour and a half of time where with this equation, I can take a 35-second exposure, figure out that I'm at the right ballpark, and then just let the shutter run and come back to it. So that can save you a ton of time if you're trying to do star trails in one exposure. All right, and now that we've got our exposure parameters more or less figured out, let's try to tackle how to get good focus, because this can be one of the really tricky things, especially if we're trying to image both elements on the ground and stars in the sky, as there's a great deal of physical distance between those two areas. And if we're keeping our lens at or near its maximum aperture, our depth of field is going to be limited. So if we try to focus our lens on the stars, depth of field in most cases is not going to be enough to extend to the elements on the ground, meaning you'll have the stars sharp, but if there's anything that has detail in the foreground, it's not likely going to be covered in depth of field, so it'll look out of focus. If you're photographing on a night before moonrise or with a new moon where there's no light in the foreground and you're not planning on doing any light painting, if your foreground is going to be primarily a silhouette, then this is not really as critical an issue. In that case, I would just focus on the stars. But if we are trying to photograph both elements on the ground and stars in the sky, and we want to make sure we have some degree of focus in both, we want depth of field to cover both. Now, if we focus our lens on those elements on the ground, however, it's going to be the same problem. Depth of field is not going to be wide enough to cover both those foreground elements and the elements in the sky. So how do we do that? Rather than trying to focus the lens on the foreground or on the background directly, if we move our plane of critical focus, or where we're focusing the lens, to the mid-range in between these 2 points, we can shift our depth of field to cover both regions. And this technique leverages a principle called hyperfocal distance. And this describes the closest focus distance at which infinity will still be acceptably sharp. So to implement this method, we need to know the hyperfocal distance of the lens that we're going to be using, and then we'll want to set the lens's focus to that distance. So you can find your hyperfocal distance for the focal length that you'll be using by doing a Google search before you go out for the evening. And this is another instance where the PhotoPills app can be really handy. It includes another calculator that allows you to factor in your camera model, so it does take into effect the format of that sensor, and then your focal length, and it will read out to you then what your hyperfocal distance is. And like with our rule of 500, there are a couple caveats to note about this method. First, it is based on optical theory, so it can be affected by the particular parameters of your actual equipment. And second, it again does require, or relies on depth of field, which is a little bit subjective. So if in doubt, if you aren't sure if you're getting good results when you're taking images using hyperfocal distance, I'd always recommend at least take a couple shots once you've got everything nailed down, once you've got your exposure and composition figured out. Take a few shots using hyperfocal distance, and take a few shots where you're focused on the stars directly, just so you have something in case the images don't look right when you get back home to your computer. You've got a little bit of a safety net. And it looks like we had a question about the base ISO and the 6 stops. Is this the slide that you guys are after? So this would be, oh yeah, I see that little red slider kind of moved. But if you're trying to gauge long duration exposures, this is a really handy method to knock it out in a matter of seconds rather than minutes. Okay. So any questions on focus and hyperfocal distance before we move along? Maybe got one comment, let's see. So hyperfocal distance doesn't have a calculator or formula in the same way that exposure duration does. There is a calculator function built into the PhotoPills application. So if you're planning on getting that, or if you have that already, that's probably the easiest way to reference it. Otherwise, if you do a Google search for a focal length of the lens that you're planning on taking out, say it's that 14 millimeters. If you do a quick search on 14 millimeter hyperfocal distance, you'll find results pretty easily there. In that case, you still want to keep in mind the format of your sensor, as that will have some impact on depth of field. But I would say, especially if you're going to be using multiple lenses, this is another area where the PhotoPills app really pays for itself pretty quickly, as it makes it super easy to reference those numbers out in the field. And then you just have to set the focus of your lens to whatever that calculator spits out. Okay, and one of our final considerations for exposure settings is that of white balance. So I typically would recommend manually setting your white balance to the daylight temperature setting for night sky imaging. And the daylight setting probably isn't going to be exactly where you want it for the final images. It's probably going to look too warm on the rear screen of your camera, and that can definitely cause some concern. But it gets you close enough that you can quickly and easily fine-tune the color temperature when you get back home to start editing. And the color temperature, the actual temperature of the night sky, usually lands somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 Kelvin, just a little bit cooler than the usual preset of daylight temperature. But manually setting your white balance at the beginning of the night means you'll be close enough, but it also means that you'll have constant color temperature for the rest of that evening, which makes it much easier to edit all of those images from that outing in a batch rather than having to edit them individually. Because if you leave your ISO, or sorry, your white balance set to auto, there's very likely going to be a variation in the actual color temperature of each image, which means you'll have to make those edits on a case-by-case basis. So manually setting it not only gets you close enough that you can get good results once you get back home, but it makes them much easier to get consistent looks from one shot to the next in the same evening. Yeah, so white balance, I would recommend setting it to the daylight preset, and it's probably not going to look right on the camera when you're shooting. Don't let that alarm you. It gets you as close as I've found you can get without dialing in an actual Kelvin number. And then from there, it's a pretty easy adjustment to make in post-production to get it to the final look that you want. The other benefit to setting it manually to daylight is that the color temperature will be the same from shot to shot. And unless you've got moonrise creeping in on your scene gradually overnight, the color temperature, once the sun is out of the sky, should not vary from shot to shot. So if you're going to use Kelvin, I would set it probably around 5,000 and plan on probably having to adjust that anyway as you get back home, because there's usually going to be some discrepancy between how it looks on the screen and how it looks on your computer. But if you put it at 5,000 Kelvin, or if you put it to daylight, it will be reasonably close. It won't require a huge amount of correction. You won't be losing information because you shot in a crazy white balance. But the other real benefit to that is that it will be consistent for that entire batch of images. Okay, and with that, we should have enough information to get started out in the field. We'll get our exposure started by figuring out how long we can leave the shutter open before our stars begin to trail. We're going to set our lens's aperture at or near its maximum aperture to make sure we're getting as much light as possible from our scene. And then we're going to modify our ISO until our histogram looks good and we're not losing information to the shadows. Once we have our exposure parameters figured out, we're going to set focus either on the stars, if that's our primary concern, or using the hyperfocal distance value for the lens that we're using if we're trying to get depth of field to cover both the ground and the sky. So generally speaking, my shutter speeds end up being anywhere between 10 and 30 seconds, depending on the focal length and the format that I'm using. Lens aperture, it's going to be as bright as I can most of the time, between 1.2 and 2.8, depending on the lens. ISO speeds usually end up being somewhere between 1600 and 6400. White balance, I'm going to manually set to daylight or 5000 Kelvin. And then the other critical thing is the file format. You definitely want to be shooting in RAW. Really the only benefit here to shooting in JPEG is a smaller file size. But the way that it achieves that smaller file size is by averaging out a lot of information that your sensor recorded. And it just doesn't leave you very much room for manipulation in post-production. And just about every image I've ever made after sunset has required some degree of post-production. There's very few that are perfect and ideal right in camera and ready to go to print or to share. So a RAW format will take up more space on your card, and it will require then that you edit that image in a post-production suite before you can share or print it. But it gives you a lot more information to work with after the fact. And since we've gone through all the trouble of getting out, finding the location, finding the right time, getting out there, spending the time out in that location, we just don't want to cut ourselves short there. Now, once we've got the basics covered, you might find you want to play around with adding additional light to foreground elements, especially if you're out on a moonless night where there's generally not going to be much light to illuminate anything on the ground. So once we've set our exposure for the dark sky, though, you may be surprised how little it takes to blow out the highlights with artificial lighting on the ground. So in this instance, I ended up taking probably a dozen shots before I found one that was workable. And if I pointed my flashlight, it was just pretty average, whatever, like a mag light. If I pointed the light source on the ground at any point, it was way too much light. So what I found I had to do here, this was a 15-second long exposure, was to aim the flashlight above the ground. So it was just the outside parts of the beam that were falling on the scene and not flashing the light directly on the scene. And then I would start my exposure and move the flashlight once over the scene, so it wasn't staying still at any given point. And that gave me enough light that I was able to pull more detail, more information out of the foreground than what my base exposure was giving me, to try to show some of the difference between the texture there in the foreground without blowing out those bright white spots. And once we've got this information and we're ready to get started, how do we keep progressing? The first thing is the time that it takes. To really get good at this, it's like anything else. It's going to require practice. And it will get easier the more often you go out and shoot, and you'll get more and more successful images from every outing. The other critical thing to improving our work as we get started in this is reviewing our work. And I generally try to recommend going through your images as close to the outing as possible, so that the experience of being there and remembering what you were changing from shot to shot, what worked, and what gives you the best representation of how it felt to be out there. That can be really helpful in trying to identify what worked and what didn't. And the more we can identify those things, the easier it becomes to implement them on our next outing. The other part of that is getting other people's feedback on our work, because other people will see things in our work that we don't see ourselves, and that can be hugely helpful. But night sky images are also some of the most fun to share. I mean, it reminds me of like that magic moment, the first print that you ever develop in the darkroom, when something comes out of nothing. It really is seeing something that you can't see, or in a different way than how you see with your own eyes. It really is one of the most magical moments to share. So with that in mind, in addition to learning how to do it more effectively, make sure we're having fun. So that's kind of the whole point of this, isn't it? Yeah, so for the adding artificial lighting, what I was doing was starting the exposure. The flashlight is pointed up and away, and it's out of frame, and then I just move the beam of the flashlight to pass through the scene once during that exposure, because if the flashlight was pointed at the ground for any duration, or if I left it still in any position, it was too much light to overwhelm the rest of the exposure there. For post-processing, so that's the end of the presentation. I'll hop back on. So for post-processing, generally the first thing I'm going to do is get my white balance figured out. So if I set it manually, and if I don't have moonlight creeping into the scene over the night, once I have the white balance figured out for one shot, I can apply that to all the images that I took on that outing, and it will be consistent then from shot to shot. And then I'm going to try to identify which images are kind of the key frames from the night, which ones had the best composition. Once I have a couple of those eyeballed, then I'll go through and look at each one and figure out which one has the best combination of composition and focus where I want it. And then from there, I'll modify or I'll edit that one file, kind of that hero image from the group. And then any edits that I make to that image, I'll apply in a batch to the rest of the images from that group, because they should be more or less the same unless there are big swings in exposure, which typically there won't be unless you're changing things intentionally, like running at a drastically different ISO or really ramping up and down your exposure durations. Once you get exposure duration so that you're getting the level of, or reducing trailing as much as you want to, you know where your aperture is going to be. For the most part, it's going to be wide open or just there. And then once you get your ISO figured out, to make sure that you're not losing information to the shadow region of your histogram, there's not going to be usually a whole lot of variation from those settings for the rest of the night. And then the bigger variations would be in different compositions and in different focus. So as I'm editing, yeah, I'll try to get the color and exposure more or less where I want it, apply that to the whole group so that then all the images look more or less the same and get to be where I want them to be. And then I'll go through the individual images to try to find the ones where I have the best combination of composition and focus. And that's usually about all I do for post-production. Yeah, try to get as much of it done in camera as possible. Now, there certainly are additional or further steps that you could take in post-production. But personally, I try to spend more time shooting than I spend on the computer as much as possible. So that's about as far as I get into it. Yeah, so let's see if we can start to run through some of these questions. Focus stacking, that can be another really helpful way of overcoming some of the limitations of shooting with limited depth of field. If you're not familiar with the concept, what it requires you to do is to take multiple exposures, shifting the point of focus within your scene between those exposures. And then in post-production, you can composite all of those images together to make an image that has greater depth of field than any one of those individual images would have. That can definitely be a really effective way of getting around limited depth of field. One of the things you have to keep an eye on, though, is you may be surprised how quickly the stars will change their position in the sky once you get out there and start running 10-second or 15-second or 30-second long exposures. So there are, I think, when you get into that, there definitely are some features in Photoshop that can be used pretty successfully, but it's definitely a little bit more involved of a task. There are also applications that are designed specifically to do that. That will be a little bit easier, but then they require an additional purchase. So that would be, I would say, more of like an intermediate level technique as you start getting into it. And if you are running into limitations where you feel that your images are being or the impact of your images are being diminished by not being able to get enough focus, that's where I'd start to go down that trail. Let's see what else we've got here.
We've got some pretty advanced questions coming in here.
Let's see what we can do.
My suggestion to you, Katie, for focus, you can practice in the daylight. Just focus on the farthest thing you can find, a mountain 10 miles away, and mark that on your lens. There's no reason to set it all the way to infinity 99.9% of the time, because you're actually, that mark is usually just past true infinity focus, and then you're losing a little bit of depth of field that you could have used. You can also pre-focus your lens in the daylight, switch it to manual, and put a piece of tape on the focus ring. And then when you go back out at night, you'll know that you're already focused at that distance.
That is true for most lenses. I will say, though, I've had, or I've noticed as I shoot between DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, a lot of mirrorless cameras use electronic focus motors rather than motors that are directly linked. And most of those cameras, or lenses, sorry, when you turn the camera off and turn it back on, it's going to revert back to usually infinity focus. And even if the ring on the lens itself hasn't moved,
yep, no, you're absolutely right.
But most of those cameras will read out the focus distance of the lens. Most mirrorless cameras, you can get that information before you take an exposure. So that can be another way of doing the same thing in a slightly different method. If you focus to that point before the sun's gone down and look at the readout of that focus distance and just make note of that, as long as you don't move your camera between that point before sunset and when you're out taking your night sky shots, then you should be able to rely on that. And even if you do move, that should at least get you pretty close. But always you want to review your images after you take them. You have to be careful about getting in too close because most cameras will allow you to get beyond the pixel level in a review. And once you go beyond 100%, you know, most things aren't going to look sharp no matter what on the back of the screen. So take that with a grain of salt.
I find too that some of the newer cameras you can actually use live view, or the newer mirrorless cameras, you can actually use the LCD screen on the back to focus at night. If you've got a camera that's more than 3 or 4 years old, that's probably not possible. Right. The quality on the screen, you're just going to see too much noise, so you don't know what's a noisy pixel and what's a star. But thank you, April. and definitely thank you,
Yeah.
Sigma. Again, everybody that's here tonight, there are discounts on Sigma lenses through f32. You should all know how to reach April. I think she can post her email address and phone number again in the chat, so you'll know how to get in touch with her. So if you're looking for one of the products that Aaron talked about today, or just about anything else, April's a great source for photo equipment. And we will definitely, we did record this, we are recording this tonight. It will be available in a couple days. It takes us some time to get it downloaded and then get it over to April, but she'll post it on probably on the Facebook page for F32, possibly on her website. And then I think I can put Aaron on the spot if he can give us a PDF of his presentation tonight. Then we can post that as slides as well on Facebook or on her website or whatever. So all of that information will be available. There's a lot to absorb, and going back through this again, you'll pick up some things that you missed tonight, I'm sure. There's a lot of technical information. So if there's any more questions, we can keep going here. If Aaron can.
Yeah, I'll just keep running through.
I think the only other one I saw was an equatorial mount. I've never played with one. I do have a friend who uses one. I don't know about Aaron, but
yeah, so that's the one I'm on right now. So if you're not familiar with what those devices are, they're also commonly referred to as star trackers. It's an accessory that you would connect between the tripod and the head. And what it does, it will counteract the rotation of the Earth to keep the stars in the same relative position in your image so that you can go beyond that exposure window that we find when we use the 500 rule or principle. So if you're primarily interested in photographing just the stars, that can be an amazingly helpful tool or an accessory to add to the kit, because that will open up your exposure window dramatically. That'll allow you to use much longer focal lengths than what you'll generally be able to do just using a tripod. The downside to that, besides being another accessory that you may not already have, is as that device is offsetting the rotation of the Earth to keep the sky in the same relative position, it means the elements on the foreground are now going to be moving. So if you have any elements of the scene in front of you in the image, they're now going to be trailed. So it's something you have to kind of balance. And if you're trying to get both a longer duration of the exposure in the sky plus a shorter duration so that the elements on the ground are going to be sharp, that's another more advanced instance where you're probably going to have to take multiple exposures and composite them after the fact. Otherwise, it becomes almost impossible to get both elements in one image with that accessory.
it's a good point. I've known people who use it for constellations and tighter things, like you said, with a longer focal length. It's never occurred to me that it would blur the foreground, but of course it would. So it's a good point. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, it looks like that's...
There's one question about the depth of field versus the 500 rule there from Steve.
No, not necessarily.
Yeah, they're really not related, except that as you change your aperture, you're going to be changing your depth of field. So
yeah,
there's a trade-off with exposure and depth of field, but the two different rules, like hyperfocal distance and the rule of 500, are not necessarily directly related to each other.
right. Yeah, they definitely they're related in the fact that they're both in considerations there at the same time, but they're not directly interacting with each other. Yeah,
Relates to my favorite photo quote, which is, photography is nothing but a series of compromises.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you again to F32 for hosting us.
Yeah, absolutely. Charles, you can contact April and she can tell you exactly how to get it. They're huge files, so posting them on something like Facebook for you to watch is easier. It's not something that we would be able to email to you, but contact April at F32 and she can tell you how she can make it available to you. Okay. There you go. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Aaron, for your time and knowledge. Thank you, April, for putting this all together. Thank you to Sigma for putting this all together. And thank you all for attending. I hope everybody enjoyed it. And there's lots of thank yous and good comments here. So thank you all for attending. Thank you for your time. Y'all have a good night.